Okay, so I thought I would start off with a bit of a potted history because a lot of this is around something that's based within my experience, my own research, the empirical work that I've been doing across the years, maybe decades, and which has culminated in some of the conclusions that I've drawn around professional education. I think it's worth just flagging up that whilst I'm mainly focused on professional thinking and professional education within a HE context, the more I work with colleagues here, the more I think there is so much that should be happening across the boundaries of HE and the compulsory sector. There is so much learning to be had across that sort of divide. And hopefully some of the work that you're doing at Hope will help to support that, because I think it's really important. So the way that this is going to be structured is I'm going to give you a bit of a background. I'm going to pose the question again and then talk you through how the response could be structured and hopefully lead to an answer as to whether being a critical professional is enough. So, a potted history. And I think I've been working, well, no, I know, I've been working for about 20-odd years in education, originally in secondary languages teaching and as a sixth form teacher in various schools, and then I moved into HE, where I started in a university languages department. But the most important thing and the most important shift in my career, I think, happened as I moved into academic or educational development. And I think here I found, well, challenges, but also reward. And it's been a really thrilling, if roller coaster ride. So I'll start off with a little bit around that. I think, first of all, I thought it would be appropriate to sort of position myself, because positionality is sort of important in these sorts of things. And I began my transfer into academic development, I'll stick with that term, when I was involved as a language lecturer, trying to enhance people's practice within the subject of teaching business languages. So I would push things around the use of simulation to set up business games so that the students were learning more actively. So very much about active learning. Also assessment. So I worked quite a lot around portfolios and looking at how portfolios could surface the thinking and the learning processes behind the product, which seemed to fit very much with what we were doing within languages. So it was about how learning was taking place and being constructed. I then had a fabulous opportunity of taking part in a couple of projects, one of which was called the Translang Project, which was about transferable skills development in non-specialist language learning. That was a national project. It involved 8 institutions and actually fed into the ultimate development of the Subject Centre for Languages. I then was asked to do something which was a bit of a sort of major experience in my life, which was run the Developing Learning Organisations project. And I think you'll see why these are important as I try and answer this question, because what I'm trying to argue will come from an organisational perspective as well as an educational and professional learning perspective. And I think it's important to recognise that synergy right from the outset. So as part of this, I was delivering, 100+ workshops, conference papers, producing stuff and all of this, which was great. But I was also involved in the construction of colleagues' learning and understanding around the subjects that they were teaching, around employability, around language learning, around the humanities and employability, all of these sorts of things. So that lasted around 8 years, and then I was invited almost as a sort of springboard when I came back to UCLan to run the postgraduate certificate in learning and teaching. which actually involved me in straight away looking at revalidation, redesign, and also accreditation by two professional bodies, the Staff and Education Development Association and the ILT, as was now HEA, Higher Education Academy. I think parallel to this, it's important to sort of note that research was going on, obviously. So research was going on into knowledge fields around pedagogy, the pedagogy of learning the subject, professional learning increasingly as I was moving along, reflective processes, which seem to be so important around employability, transferable skills, and ultimately professional learning, work-based learning, assessment design, employability. And as I took on the role of running the PG Cert, that continued, and that was actually constructed largely around ongoing use of projects as a resource. I see projects very much as a space whereby you can access a dedicated resource, bring people together, and actually work in a very sort of focused way to take things forward. So I was involved in a national practitioner-based literature review, which is quite interesting because it was about coming from that practitioner perspective and engaging with the theory and doing something that was very, very structured and rigorous in the form of a literature review. Working with JISC to develop a blended learning environment to support a community of practice. Doing work around student transitions into university and indeed beyond first year into second year, which I think is probably an even more crucial transition in many respects. Project work around academic identity and the development of a professional knowledge base, which has very much focused my attention since developing the EdD, and of course practitioner research throughout all of this. One of the outcomes of this was actually to design a continuing professional education award programme, and I hope you can see that. It was actually structured in levels, moving from initial teacher education to continuing professional education or development, whichever way you want to look at it. And it was very staged to allow entry and exit and to allow also pauses to be had, because that's the way professionals in education seem to work. It's very difficult for them to sometimes devote that time ongoing because careers change. So it started off with a suite of PG certs, postgraduate certificates in various subjects. As you can see, I brought those together and designed most of them. And then that's developed into a postgraduate diploma with further things that worked on developing the practitioner research side and also some of the focus areas, and then into a master's in education and ultimately into the EdD. Alongside this, I was developing practice across an organisation by trying to build the ability for colleagues to have a critical and scholarly eye on what they were doing with respect to pedagogy. So this allowed me to develop an institution-wide pedagogic research forum, a journal, to run annual conferences, things like this. And again, was an element that I think you'll see comes together in this, answering the question that I've posed. For myself, I was developing my profile within a number of communities, and these are just a selection of them. So I was working with CEDA, I led the community for their professional development framework, was a member of CEDA exec, I was working for the HEA doing projects, I was also within the institution engaged in numerous communities. And I think that's an important aspect of what we do as professionals. And so I think it's appropriate to just reflect a little bit on what that's about. So if I think about communities and how we work within them and our journeys through our careers and through our practice, there's things like the work of Wenger, which has so much influenced how we think about entry into communities and progression through, and I've aligned that to a novice to master sort of trajectory. Out of that we can draw ideas such as peripheral practice leading into academic leadership. And coincidentally, of course, I was working this morning with colleagues on academic leadership and their own personal profiles as leadership. So it moves from the acquisition of knowledge and skills initially to ultimately, as a leader, generating new knowledge and skills for the community. It also involves, and again, I haven't put the name in because it's Wenger again, talking about boundary crossing. We have to, as professionals, be able to operate within these diverse communities and also boundary cross. So we're not just in a diverse and complex setting with multiple memberships, but we're also agile in operating at the boundaries, but across the boundaries. So that also makes me think about power of organisations, power of people within communities, and led me recently to explore some work by Lindqvist, which, if I recall rightly, is 2011, on cultivities of practice as opposed to communities. And the reason why he starts talking about cultivities is because cultivities are led by the practitioner as opposed to being directed by people in power, as communities of practice can be. They can be hijacked by organisations. So cultivities lend themselves to a discursive, peer-led, purposeful and proactive approach to development. Okay, so that's me, picture of me. Ultimately what I did was I drew all this together and got my doctorate by publication, which was a professional doctorate. I deliberately targeted that because I was at the time developing the professional doctorate myself, and I wanted to base that very, very strongly in an understanding of what the nature of professional doctoral learning was. And so I was trying to create synergy in my development with things that I was working on. At the time I was also leading the first successful RAE, and it was the RAE at that time within the institution for education. So, all well and good, but this maybe returns us to the question about critical professionalism and whether that's enough. I think it's worth starting with some of the further issues about where I position myself. In terms of professionalism and professional learning, I position myself with respect to the knowledge field as being contested, complex, dynamic, more so as we're going through things, discursive, contingent, in that it's very much affected by what's going on around it, and relational. So some of the people that I draw on in this, Balzac's, Avis and Evans, really, really crucial works in terms of the politically and power-laden context of professional education, which is also part and parcel of Colley and James's work and things coming from there. Boo, Darrow, Robson, about this sort of dual professionalism, about work-based learning, about professional and reflective learning. Eisner and Schulman, I'll talk a bit more about them because I think that again goes back to this novice to master and a career progress of learning. And of course the role of professional bodies, we cannot escape that sort of idea. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort of deconstruct some of the aspects of professional learning, and I am cognizant that so many of you know a lot about this, so please do, respect the fact I'm coming from a HE perspective where we're pretty ignorant in that sort of thing for a large extent, unfortunately, but we're learning. So, the learning of HE academics. Well, we've already talked about the complexity of the knowledge base, so the sort of rainbow thing sort of shows some of the array of different knowledge areas that we have to be competent, if not highly skilled in research, admin, assessing, supporting learning, etc., etc. There's also a series of continua which are engaged with the professional development and learning of academics or of any professional. The shift, and I've heard that mentioned a few times this week by people, from unconscious competence to conscious incompetence. I use that deliberately because I think that's when we can start to be leaders, because we can start to articulate our knowledge and help others engage with it. That's based on something by race. The shift from tools and techniques to artistry that is so much part and parcel of Eisner's work, and the shift from a technical stance to a pedagogic, to a curricular perspective on teaching and learning, and also alongside that a shift from self and what am I doing right and wrong, am I standing behind this mic right, or could I really be doing what I want to be doing, which is moving across the room, to what are the students getting from this. And I think that's my concern at the moment, that you're getting something valuable. And that's really from Kraber and a whole host of writers. Alongside that, there is the professional knowledge approach, which looks at this shift from knowledge, novice to expert, and of actually superimposing on that journey, if you like, that trajectory, metacognitive awareness of what you're learning and how, so that it can become more proactive, more agentic, if you like. When I look at the professional knowledge base as a sort of construct, as a field, the interesting things for me are stuff by Schulman, his 7 areas of professional knowledge for educators, which when I sort of deconstruct it, I sort of sit there and I think, hey, that's almost what the UK Professional Standards Framework is about when you take it apart. So there are these parallels constantly emerging, and I think these are important to recognise and to acknowledge. But it is nevertheless vastly complex, and to be expert or to even to be competent in all those areas is challenging, hugely challenging for us, let alone for you in teaching your students with respect to teacher ed, and certainly for me in helping professionals learn. There's another model which I very much like. I like Barnett's work. It's difficult, but I like it. And I love his model, which I've called a professional identity model, because what he does there is he talks about, and this can be related to all sorts of subject fields, which is why it's so exciting. It's actually founded in curriculum design, but it's talking about knowing, the field of knowledge, the concrete knowledge base. But alongside that, there are areas of being. How do we be a scientist, for example? How do we be an educator or a HE academic? How do we do the doing of it, in other words? And these differ from subject to subject, and that's fascinating. But what he also recognises is that within this, when you look at curriculum design, these actual circles are weighted differently. So in nursing, the doing is very, very significant, but also that there's that huge scientific knowledge base that you've got to relate to. So his way of thinking about how we view knowledge and identity is very important, I think. And he's also linked in, sorry, I've swapped them around, haven't I? The acting is the doing of it. The being is the values side of it. So I apologise for that. That's me reading it backward. But those 3 interlocking circles are very, very important in constructing how our knowledge base can be conceived. And is very much, as you can see by the being, which I've done really big here, with values and all that we treasure about education. That's why I've drawn it so large. I think it's actually probably larger. There's also a career progression model. Can be based around the apprenticeship model. The Dreyfus and Dreyfus work, for example, quite dated but useful. or a developmental model, well established, early career, mid-career, late career. Thing that I think is interesting in this sort of perspective is the issue of me PLC. Now that was something that's been around ever since we've been talking about employability. It's been played around with. The idea of PLC as in public limited company, of course, we are, in managing our own careers, managing ourselves as public limited companies, as it were. So we are responsible for thinking about our trajectory and journey through success and so on and so forth. So that really positions you differently in respect of your relationship with your career. It makes it something that is owned by you and your responsibility to some extent. You can't just sort of let it go and be the organisation's job. Alongside this, certainly for HE, something that is the case is there is a huge diversification around academic roles and functions now. Cashmore were writing about that in 2013 as a result of a project that they ran for the HEA, and Locke has just published on that, and there's currently another project working on it at the moment. Careers in academic environments are changing vastly. Administrators do more student support than they did in the past. Academic roles are disaggregating, and to some extent you find that people who are looking at the technical side of delivery are having more of a curriculum role, more of a teaching learning knowledge or need to be competent in that area. So roles are shifting. It is happening in research because the demands are so heavy now. We have people who will be project managers within a research context, and that will be a role. There will be people who have more of a function around bidding, and that will become a role within research and is in many large institutions already regarded that way. So it means that we're working a lot more across teams, across roles, across functions, and our careers cannot be certainly or definitely predicted. They're going to shift, chop and change, go high, go low, and etc., etc. And we have to think about this and be aware of it. Oops, sorry. Finally, a critical reflection model. Some of you have seen this before because for me this is really important because it feeds into a lot of what I've recently been doing about dialogue and using dialogue to support professional learning. Here, this work by Aero, I've drawn to show how I understand what he's talking about. And he's talking about a deliberative process by professionals learning in the workplace to generate action and do their practice. It involves some quite complex stuff, however. Framing problems, searching for the knowledge, engagement with values, and engaging with the wider drivers and assumptions that we are making. So it's a very sort of power-laden process, very, very challenging. On the other side, we are engaging with complexity. We have to be self-aware, self-monitoring, me PLC again, aware of our strengths and weaknesses, and engaging in a metacognitive process as well to manage that. So I think that's a very, very useful model for me in thinking about professional learning. I'm just sort of catching up with myself because I've not been turning over pages. So, however, there is a but. There is a but. Because there is a need for space and time for all of this to happen and for all this professional learning to happen. So still coming from a bit more of an informed empirical side, sort of experiential side, I'm thinking about, well, okay, how could I, the practitioner in charge of academic development, go about doing this? So one of the things I was doing was developing space for learning. I did it through courses in a formal context. I did it through projects because they provide time, resource, space, funds. And I did it in practice with colleagues through dialogue in forums and, for example, the Pedagogic Research Forum. informed by some of the work of Brookfield, who I think he writes a fabulous little sort of chapter in his 1995 book about a very structured dialogue with highly experienced academics, for example, and how he manages that to bring out the learning of what is going on. And Gay, with his appreciative conversations and the way that he works with reflection, absolutely fabulous stuff. And Barnett talking about us developing ourselves discursively in and around practice. So all of these concepts are there with that. Workload, time. People are constantly talking about these things. So I tried to develop facilitated learning spaces a little bit more overtly, as we've already talked about in those three areas. Using dialogue with peers. I was trying to make these safe spaces where dialogue could happen safely, where practice could be the focus of reflection and deconstruction and scholarship, and where meaning could be constructed that was meaningful in terms of the wider pedagogical fields, but also in terms of our own understandings and doings of our practice and acting within practice. What I did find is that these spaces did ensure progressive participation. You could structure people to move through the journeys from novice to master. You could help them develop confidence safely. You could develop expertise safely. It could allow risk to take place and be engaged with in safe spaces, and it supported learning. I also thought about, well, how can I create wider enabling structures and draw people's attention to those? So one side was to use the formal activities that we engage in around our practice, in developing our practice. And on the other side, some of the more formal institutional activities like peer observation of teaching, planning of teaching, evaluation and review, validation. By building these differently, structuring these differently, I feel we can build in space for this reflective, process-orientated construction of knowledge around practice, which is so necessary for professional educators. Okay, so I'm going to bring it all together. And what this left me with was actually 5 premises, which I talk about in the book that we've just produced. So public, a bit of a promotion there. The first premise is the professional learns best through social, discursive and reflective processes structured in and around practice. Second thing is there is a need for progressive structures to support identity creation around career, role, personal and professional need. There is a requirement that we determine what educational knowledge is, or what professional knowledge is, who owns it and how it is acquired and developed. A power-laden sort of sentence that, I think. We need to acknowledge that professional learning is contingent and situated within organisations. It is about contextualised practices and processes. And we need to design purposeful and embedded approaches to professional learning that maximise the necessary critical learning opportunities. How can we do this? Well, one of my first steps was to try and draw this. I'm a visual learner, hold up my hands, have to draw things. So after many, many stops and starts, I ended up with this model, which pulls together a lot of what I write about in the book. And the first point is that we consider the complexity, we need to consider the complexity of knowledge and practice. This is almost like a precursor for professional learning, for the critical professional to be effective. We need to recognise that they learn through informed and critical reflection, so that needs to be supported. Hence the spaces, hence the formal spaces where courses can be engaged with, where knowledge created and skills acquired. We need to bear in mind this issue about communities and cultivities and boundaries, and the fact that we have to be very, very skilled in the multiple discourses across these diverse communities in which we operate. So in order to structure that passage, if you like, from acquisition of skills and a baseline to actually being able to act agentically and act as a critical professional and act as in charge of me PLC, we need learning spaces and enabling structures. These, again, require some considerations to be borne in mind. The critical professional needs to be aware of their own professional capital and how to develop and apply it. And I will talk about professional capital a bit more in a minute. We need to be able to identify and use selectively opportunities for purposeful learning. And we need to apply agency within the organisational context. And that means knowing what we can influence and what the boundaries are and where we can operate. And I think all too often what happens for practitioners, because things are moving at such a pace, is we start to become disempowered. We allow ourselves to almost adopt a victim approach. Everything's happening too fast. With learning spaces and enabling structures, I think we can create that opportunity to step back and actually start to say, hey, what is my operational space? What is my influencing space? What is my scope for agentic action? And then we can start to make things happen. And also get a little bit more motivated in the meanwhile. I'll see whether you agree with this as we continue. So, all of that is great, but it's not enough. I've got business things in the background. I've got an MBA. I think we need an organisational solution. We can't just leave it to the practitioner working on their own Joe blogs, Josephine blogs, struggling away as individuals. It's got to be addressed from an organisational perspective as well. So, come back to professional capital. Increasingly, educators are being seen as producers. There's an emphasis on disempowerment, on performativity. And the outcome for so many of us is that this leads to tension, frustration, and stress. The ideal, on the other hand, is that we have an appreciation of our value. We're doing it. We're the front end. We're the ones who are structuring the learning. We are facilitators. We have autonomy and indeed quite a bit of accountability. There should be consideration of power and choice in this. So I think that if we start to talk about professional capital and what our capital is as professionals, we can actually start to engage in a negotiation between the organisation and the relevant power bodies, the stakeholders as it were, around what is the nature of the contract, what is the nature of professional capital, who has a responsibility to develop it from the organisation, and how do we play our role within that? Because it's got to be a dual activity undertaking. So professional capital, I think, a recognition of that, allows us to start to create clarity on value, personal and use value. It allows us to renegotiate the professional contract. It allows us to bring in organisation, institutions, professional bodies, wider institutions, and individuals in dialogue at the table. It also allows us to engage with ideas of what is the payoff in all of this, and to invest appropriately in capacity and capability development. Further thinking about this then. Okay, so what will spaces look like when we start to think about this organisationally and in a bigger way? First of all, in the central circle, we have to recognise how the individual practitioner learns. The research and scholarship that has to be engaged with and made time for around teaching and learning as much as around the actual subject development. We need to think about the reflection and the reflective process that is so necessary for professionals and for individual practitioners in learning. And we need to think about that issue of dialogue and the role of community and peers in all of this. Okay, fine. So individual sits at the centre. There are then two sections. There's the organisation or policy-led side of the equation and how spaces can be structured. And these can be driven by the wider context, by policy, or by professional bodies, by a multiple array of stakeholders. When we get down to the organisation, that sort of middle tier of the diagram, the organisation often goes for workshops and training. And we all know what HR and writers on learning organisations have to say about that. It is widely recognised that your training event, you bob in, you bob out, practice takes over, nothing happens. Because it's difficult. It's difficult to take what you learn in that disconnected space into your practice. And that's why you get people like Pedler, Burgoyne, all the people writing, Sanger and all these sorts of guys, writing about how do we actually embed learning beyond the training that we do, beyond the workshop. So they talk now about action learning sets. They talk about appreciative conversations. They talk about mentoring. I don't know an institution up and down the HE sector that hasn't got some sort of mentoring program as part of its leadership development. On the other side, there are things like projects. Projects can be organisationally structured. But again, what happens after that project disappears? How do you use that champion? Because they go back. They disappear. So how do you embed that in the organisation? Formal courses, great. Because what they do is they build that generic knowledge base, which is part and parcel of what we need to do if you go back to Barnett's knowing, acting, being sort of diagram. But it's not enough. It can create space, but still, how do you embed things? You look at the practitioner-led side, and you think, well, okay, the vast majority of those, well, practitioners will choose to go under formal courses. Of course we will. Some of us enjoy them. I'll hold up my hands. I love a formal course because it allows me to complete and think about, well, am I 60% or am I 50 here? It's great because you can talk and you can do things in groups and get that sort of energy going. Projects, I've already described how useful that is, and so many people use projects to structure and direct their learning. A lot of things that we learn by and through that are practitioner-led are, of course, practitioner groups, forums, networks, communities of practice, both internal to the organisation and beyond the organisation around our subjects, around our disciplines. Still not there yet. We're still trying to bring all these ideas together. Is this being critical professional enough? Okay, I think there's a need for balance. Going back to this professional capital idea, we need to think about the organisational side in this. We need to think about the practitioner side in this. We need to think about enablers, facilitators. We can't leave it all to the individual. We can't just sit back and say, well, the organisation's going to manage it. Ain't going to happen. It's got to be a coherent, purposeful, strategic undertaking. And I think that professional capital idea means that organisations have to recognise how professionals learn. So, because I was writing a book and because you have to do these things when you're proposing things in the literature, I thought, well, I need a model. So I drafted a model. And the scored model is the one that I'm proposing. It's organisationally structured. It's very much founded in learning organisational thinking. It requires that we think about how are we creating space for reflection on practice? How are we enabling communities of practice to learn from others to occur? How are we structuring opportunities for discussion? How are we enabling research and scholarship to take place? Where's the education in formal courses? It's got to take place, and the development of critical professional perspectives. All of those components have to be within the model that will enable the professional to learn and to create a coherent way of structuring professional development for HE academics, I feel. Education practitioners across the board, possibly. These are all interlinked, interconnected, they're mutually reinforcing, they're mutually constructive, they are enabling. If they're all engaged with across an organisation, they mustn't be disassociated from one another. There has to be thinking about how do they work together to do this. So when I deconstruct some of these, and I know you probably won't be able to read some of this, but the practitioner-based activity can happen through peer observation, course development and review, peer discussion, team learning and reflection. How do we frame that more formally within the processes of doing our work within the organisation? And I think that is something the organisations have to address, because often what we're saying is you have to develop a course in a week. Oh, yeah, easy, you do it. Go and sit in a room for a week and you'll develop a course. But it's not about that. It's about something bigger. It's about engaging with the students. It's about engaging with employers. It's about engaging with the team. It's about thinking about the resourcing. It's all very, very complex. And in fact, when you look at how professional practitioners learn, they learn an immense amount. It's their preferred learning around curriculum design. Communities of practice, we need to run them at local, team and department level. We need to have a community of champions so that the champions can talk to one another and exchange and learn from each other. So the space needs to be created in cross-institutional networks, forums and groups. We need to have opportunities for practitioner dialogue to take place through mentoring, through buddy pairings, through learning sets, peer review, through practice-based conversations. Of course we need courses. And there are a huge range of courses and models for courses that are being developed. Came across a lovely idea of an Australian one recently, the Decamod. 10 little modules that you pick and you accumulate as part of your CPE. And project activity, so opportunities for action, research and scholarship of learning and teaching. I love the idea of the Canadian Teaching and Learning Commons, the American Teaching and Learning Commons. They're really pushing that agenda. Communities, journals, events for sharing outcomes. So, within this, we position the critical professional, the precursor behaviours, which I've already talked through, and the active behaviours of being more proactive, more agentic or agentic in our management of our own learning and our understanding of the organisation and the opportunities that we have across our career and using those. I don't think it's enough to be a critical professional. I think you need a coherent, holistic, joined-up approach that requires more stakeholders to come and sit around the table and to say, what are we actually doing if education is actually going to succeed in this?